So last week in Grow Group, we finished reading through the book of Deliverers, the main central section of the book of Judges, which tells the story of the 12 people that God used to rescue or deliver the people of Israel during the time period of the Judges. And out of those 12, we've looked at 4 major ones. And the way we can differentiate those 4 major ones to see their character, to see their heart, is by looking at what they did after they'd saved Israel, after they'd delivered Israel. Deborah is the first major judge. After she delivered Israel with Barak, they wrote basically a worship song together to celebrate God's victory in them and through them. Then we moved down to Gideon. And after Gideon had rescued Israel, he went around Israel and punished those who hadn't helped him. Eventually, he ended up making an ephod and an idol that the people of Israel worshipped. And we'll not talk about what his kids did. Then you can look at Jephthah, who went all the way to saving Israel, but only at the cost of sacrificing his own daughter, performing a child sacrifice, which is one of the main reasons that God wanted to kick the Canaanites out of the promised land. And then the story of Samson, which in reality, the only way he could save Israel was by killing himself in the process. And today we're going to be reading the final section of the book of Judges. It's going to feel very different to what we've read so far. There's no cycle of things that happen where the people rebel, God raises up their enemies, then God raises up a judge and saves them. That doesn't happen. There is little to no description of how God views these events, even though we know that he is displeased by them. All we get is a primarily descriptive account of what happens. And it shows us how deep into sin the nation of Israel have sunk during this time period of the Judges. In this section, it's less to do with the enemies from without, but the cancer within. God isn't punishing them with a foreign enemy. Rather, he's giving them over to their sin. And these 2 stories that we'll read in this session don't follow chronologically along after the book of Deliverers. It's not as if Samson did his thing and then these 2 stories happened. We get a couple of time references based on who was priest at the time in these stories, which actually date them quite early in the timeline of the Judges. So we know these happened earlier rather than later. And in this section, we get a new phrase echoed through them. It says, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Sometimes it's just shortened to, in those days, Israel had no king. And in these 2 stories, this is the only commentary that the author of Judges adds into the story. And it has quite a condemning tone to it. And we're not sure whether the author is looking forward to the days of the king, saying, if only we had a king, these issues wouldn't happen. Or maybe it's looking back retroactively and saying, even if we had a king, it wouldn't have sorted out these problems because all the kings did as they saw fit as well. But everyone's in agreement that this phrase points toward the idea that Israel were not living with their God. They were not living with Yahweh as king. And the mess that ensued is obvious. So in our first story, we're going to meet a man named Micah. And he collects up some stolen silver and creates an idol out of it to set up a shrine in his home, possibly with many other false gods as well. And then he persuades a Levite to come and stay with him to be his priest. This is a great career move for this low-level Levite. He's now the priest of a family, maybe even a small town. Then in the following chapter, we meet the tribe of Dan, who, if you remember from earlier in the book of Judges, they were unable to conquer the land God had given them. And so they had to be kept up in the hill country. But they wanted a land to call their own, so they sent out a scouting party to try and find a place they could have a home, have their own city. And on their way, they passed Micah's house and met the priest and saw the shrine that he took care of. And then when they assembled their forces to go and overtake this distant city, they passed by Micah's house, stole the idol, stole all the things in the shrine, and persuaded that priest to come and work for them. Another great career move for that Levite, who went from being a Levite to the priest of a family to now the priest of a whole tribe. And this story just goes to show the foolishness of man-made religion. When the nation of Israel don't worship God, they're still going to worship, but they're going to argue about their worship, and they're going to worship false gods, false idols that really give them no help at all. And our second story in chapters 19 through 21 is one of the most saddest stories in all of the Bible. It's as if the people of Israel have completely forgotten who their God is, what he is like, and how he has called them to live. They're living just as bad or even worse than the Canaanites who God had called them to kick out of the land. In chapter 19, we meet another Levite who ends up marrying a prostitute. And he and his wife are one day on their way home, and they end up needing to spend the night in the city of Gibeah in Benjamin. And they plan on just spending the night in the town square because no one had invited them to stay. But late into the night, an old man comes and invites them to stay. He says it's not safe to stay in the town square. But then the men of the city gather around this man's house, pounding on the door, demanding that they send out the Levite so that they can rape him. The old man pleads with these people, urging them not to do such a wicked thing. And they end up sending out the man's wife. The men of the city abuse her all night long. And in the morning, when the Levite wakes up, he finds his wife dead on the doorstep. And so he loads her up, takes her home, cuts her body into 12 pieces, and sends a piece to every tribe in Israel. Then in chapter 20, the whole nation of Israel gather to wage war against Benjamin for this vile thing that has happened in their tribe. And the men of Benjamin fight against Israel, and at first they're holding their own, but eventually they are overcome and defeated. And the death count in this chapter is well over 100,000 people. And by the end, all that's left of the tribe of Benjamin are 600 men. Then in chapter 21, there is a vast weeping that happens because one of the tribes of Israel has been cut off. And so they come up with this deranged plan to try and get wives for these 600 men so that they can continue their tribe, can continue their families. First of all, they go to the town of Jabesh Gilead. This town didn't come to fight against the Benjaminites. They stayed away. So they went and slaughtered all the people of that town and just kept the young virgins alive and gave them to these Benjamite men. There was about 400 women captured that day. But that still left 200 men without wives. And so they made another plan that at an upcoming annual festival where all Israel were together, there's a point in that festival where the young women come out and dance. And so they plan for these 200 men to go and capture a wife and run away with her so that that tribe could continue. If the first story showed the religious and theological corruption that was standard in those days, then this second story shows the depth of moral corruption and brokenness that comes as a result of them not following God's law. And then the book of Judges ends with this ominous, condemning tone. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And so as you read these stories in your Grow group today, it's okay to feel the weight of them. We're not meant to be okay with what is happening. We're meant to feel the brokenness. We're meant to feel that disgust. That's why the author of Judges included them. And again, this is our first pass through, so it's okay to feel a little lost as we read them. As we continue through this Grow Group series, these stories will make more sense. So I invite you to read these things now.